Hello class. So this is our last chapter for this term. This time we are focusing on Japan. We're focusing specifically on the modernization of Japan. Our objectives for this chapter. First, we're going to look at why Japan ended its isolation. Up until this point, Japan was very isolated from the rest of trade going on in Asia and all around the world. The second thing we're looking at is trace the growth of Japanese imperialism. Like many of its European counterparts, Japan starts to imperialize many different parts of Asia as well, Taiwan being one of them. So let's look at the reason why Japan was able to be isolated. Now, the first reason why Japan is so isolated from most of the world is, first of all, its geography. Japan is a group of islands. Not one island, it is up to thousands of islands. This proves to be very difficult for Western powers to take over. Another reason is it has a strong samurai culture. That means they have a strong culture of warriors that are protecting the people in Japan. The last thing is that Japan becomes very specific about who they're trading with. Japan decides they're allowed to trade with China. China has many similar things in their culture to Japan, which makes it more of an understandable reason to trade with them. The second place where Japan does trade is with the Dutch, who are in Indonesia. The last one is that Japan at this point has a diplomacy contract with Korea. That means there's a contract signed between the two nations that will allow for peaceful talks together, which also allows trade. But Japan overall is very skeptical of Western powers. The reason why Japan is quite skeptical of Western powers is, in general, Japan holds its culture at a very high level. They don't necessarily want other people to come in and sort of mess with their culture. That didn't mean that Western people did not try. We have Britain, France, Russia, and Americans are all trying to trade with Japan. And every time, this man, the Emperor of Japan at the time, he denies them. He says, no, I do not want to trade with you. I'm perfectly happy trading with China, Korea, and the Dutch in Indonesia. Then we have, what ends up happening, is we have an American man named Matthew Perry. What Matthew Perry ends up doing is he goes into the Tokyo harbor with these 4 beautiful steam ships from America. The emperor sort of sees these ships and how much more technologically advanced these ships are compared to Japanese ships, and starts to realize that he is going to have to start trading with Western powers. What ends up happening is we have Matthew Perry has a letter from the American president. And Matthew Perry threatens the emperor and forces him to open trade with the U.S. Now, Matthew Perry's letter from Fillmore, the American president, is quite a nice letter. Fillmore, the American president, is asking nicely to open trade. The way that Matthew Perry delivers it is a threat. He is forcing Japan to start trading with the U.S. This is with the Treaty of Kanagawa in 1854, and this is when Japan starts to open ports to America. Now, Japan, like China, only opens 2 ports to foreign trade. The reason why they only open two ports is so that Japan can control what sort of foreign trade is coming. By 1860, Japan has many trade agreements with many different nations. So Matthew Perry opens the door in Japan for many countries to come in and trade. After foreign trade starts to open in Japan, the Japanese citizens are not very happy about this, and they get angry at the shogun. The shogun is the person in charge of Japan. He is sort of like a military dictator. The reason they get angry at the shogun is, yes, he is in charge, Now there's still a separate Japanese emperor, and this emperor, he is sort of identifies sort of what Japanese culture is to the Japanese, and they look to him. His name, and I'm sorry if I mess this up, is Mutsuhito. Mutsuhito is the emperor, and basically the Japanese people at this time forced the shogun to step down in Japan, and the emperor, Mutsuhito, steps up as the new ruler. This begins a new era in Japan called the Meiji era. The Meiji era, now the emperor has control of Japan again. And part of what the people are hoping is that the Meiji emperor is going to force many of these foreigners out of their country. Now this emperor, Mutsuhito, what he ends up doing is he realizes he has to start playing the same game that a lot of these Western European countries are playing. And what he ends up doing is he modernizes Japan. How he modernizes Japan is in a Western way. And the way that he starts to develop this is by sending people to different parts of Europe to learn from them. He ends up modeling Japan government after Germany. He admired German centralized government. He also admired the German army. In Britain, Japanese started modeling their navy after them. That means any sort of army on the water, basically. They also looked to America and modeled the Japanese education system after American influence. What this meant is that every child in Japan now had to go to school for a certain amount of years. This also led to many Japanese studying abroad at a very young age. The last thing that Emperor Mutsuhito ends up doing for Japan is industrialization. Japan starts mimicking a lot of Western European countries with industrializing. One of the first things that he does is starts building a railway. Another thing that he ends up doing is building thousands of factories. The industries in Japan were slightly different than the ones in Europe. Industries such as tea, that were easy export to Europe, was one. We also have silk production, and many different kind of unique things to Japan that they were able to easily trade with European countries. This ultimately leads to a growing industry in Japan. And by 1890, Japan has a strong navy and a large army. 4 years later, Japan actually gets Western nations to give up their extraterritorial rights. The way that Japan does this is they are demonstrating to Europeans that their constitution is very similar to the West, and that any foreigner in their country will still be treated with respect. Western nations, many European countries, decide to agree, and they give up their extraterritorial rights in Japan. What this ultimately leads to is that Japan gets a big head. Now Japan is full of pride, and they also recognize that they believe that they are on par as far as power and control with a lot of other Western nations. What this ends up leading to is that Japan starts becoming more imperialistic. What that means is they're going to start picking fights with different Asian countries. The first place that Japan decides to start dominating is Korea. Now Korea, what the Japanese do is they force Korea to open 3 ports to Japan for trade. This is in 1876. But China also trades with Korea. Because China and Japan are both see the value of Korea, they end up signing sort of an agreement that neither Japanese or Chinese troops are allowed to enter Korea. What ends up happening is China breaks this. China ends up sending troops in Korea to put out the rebellions that are happening against the Korean emperor. This, of course, upsets Japan, and it leads to a war. Well, a very, very brief battle. Japan ends up sending troops and their navy to Korea, and what they end up doing there is they end up dominating the Chinese navy. Even though it is only a few months long, Japan has completely wiped out the Chinese navy, and they are forcing Chinese to sign a peace treaty. And in this peace treaty, China gives Japan some Chinese territory. Part of this territory is called Manchuria, which we would know today as an area close to Mongolia. Another area that Japan ends up getting from the Chinese after this war is Taiwan. As you know, Japan is a presence in Taiwan for some period of time. This is due to what happens in 1985 when Japan attacks China. Here we have is a very interesting sort of picture of the Japanese military at this time. As you can see, they're a very well-equipped army. They have state-of-the-line technology with guns. Also, their armor is quite good as well. We go on to talk about more imperialism in Japan. Now, if you remember, Japan gained the state of Manchuria from China after the fight against China in 1885. What ends up happening is that in 1903, we have Japan and Russia are fighting over Manchuria. Now, it all starts because Japan says that they will respect the rights of Russians living in Manchuria, as long as Russia stays out of Korea, because Korea is an important trading post for Japan. Russia, who is starting to gain more economic and political power, disagrees. They will not stay out of Korea, and they will not stay out of Manchuria. And so they end up going to war. Japan ends up attacking Russia in 1904, a year later. And this starts the Russo-Japanese War. The outcome of this war is that 1 year later, we have the treaty ends, and what it ends up happening is that Russia loses, and Japan gains all the captured areas. That being, they continue to rule over Manchuria. After this Russo-Japanese War, the Japanese turn around and they occupy Korea. Basically, Japan realizes how valuable Korea is. Korea is in between Russia and China and many other trade routes, and Japan now decides that they are going to take direct control. In 1905, we have Japan makes Korea a protectorate of Japan. A few years later, Japan takes complete control over Korean's government. They are able to sort of kick out the king in Korea at that time and take over the government completely. Japan rules harshly in Korea, which leads to a lot of Koreans getting quite angry at the Japanese rule in Korea. Firstly, Japan takes away studying Korean language in schools and forces Koreans to study Japanese language and Japanese subjects. Secondly, Japan dominates economy. They encourage Japanese businessmen to come over and start companies in Korea, but they do not allow any Korean to start their own business. This leads to Koreans having a strong sense of nationalism. They take pride in their culture, and they will fight Japan no matter what. As you can say, today, there's still a struggle, there's still tension between Japanese and Koreans. And that is over this time when Japan is occupying Korea. Now, most of the other Western countries realize how harsh the Japanese are treating Koreans. But they ignore it, because many of these Western countries are doing their own imperialistic ventures in other countries and doing similar things that Japanese are doing.